The first tremor did not come from a runway or a boardroom, but from a whisper that moved too quickly to be contained. News that Eric Forrester was quietly designing for Katie Logan's new Logan project spread through the fashion world like a controlled burn that suddenly caught the wind. What had begun as speculation hardened into certainty within hours, amplified by insiders eager to be first rather than accurate. For Ridge, the revelation landed not as a professional disagreement but as a personal rupture. It struck at the unspoken assumption that the foundations of Forrester Creations were immutable. That loyalty, especially his father's, was not something that required constant defense. In a single morning, that assumption collapsed, replaced by a corrosive sense of betrayal that felt intimate, humiliating, and strategic all at once. Ridge's anger was not loud at first. It was precise, inward, and deeply unsettling. He did not see Eric's involvement with Logan as a simple collaboration. He saw it as an act that destabilized the carefully maintained hierarchy of power within Forrester Creations. To him, Eric was not merely a designer lending his genius elsewhere but the symbolic heart of the company itself. His signature, his legacy, and his authority were inseparable from the Forrester name. By choosing to create for a competing house, one led by a Logan, no less, Eric had crossed a boundary Ridge believed was sacred. In Ridge's mind, this was not innovation but insurrection, not evolution but erosion. And erosion, once begun, was difficult to stop. As Ridge moved swiftly behind the scenes to contain the damage, the situation worsened in ways no one could have anticipated. A junior employee at Logan Creations, careless and unprepared for the scale of what they were handling, let slip key elements of Eric's early strategy to a reporter hungry for exclusivity. The disclosure was not malicious, but its consequences were devastating. Suddenly, what had been whispered became dissected, analyzed, and framed as an open declaration of war. Headlines speculated about secret alliances, generational coups, and the end of the Forrester era. The fashion press, ever eager for a narrative larger than fabric and form, transformed a design collaboration into a referendum on legacy and power. The pressure mounted instantly. Eric found himself under siege from all sides, scrutinized by the media, questioned by his own family, and positioned as either a revolutionary visionary or a traitor depending on who was asked. For the first time in years, retreat was not an option disguised as dignity. Silence, once his preferred shield, now threatened to become an admission of guilt. Every attempt to downplay the situation only fueled speculation, allowing others to define his intentions for him. In that crucible, something in Eric shifted. The quiet patience that had guided him for decades gave way to a sharper resolve. He recognized that restraint, in this moment, would not preserve peace but surrender the narrative entirely. Rather than withdraw, Eric chose confrontation, but on his own terms. He abandoned the strategy of discretion that had once protected him, embracing instead a radical transparency that startled even his closest allies. Without warning, he summoned the press to an emergency conference. The urgency of the invitation alone enough to send shockwaves through the industry. The announcement reverberated far beyond the walls of Forrester Creations, igniting speculation that something irreversible was about to unfold. Within the family, confusion turned to dread. Ridge interpreted the move as escalation, Brooke as recklessness, and Katie as something she could not yet name. None of them were prepared for the clarity with which Eric intended to speak. The press conference itself unfolded with an intensity that felt almost theatrical, though nothing about it was staged. Standing before cameras and colleagues alike, Eric did not hedge or soften his words. He spoke of creativity not as property but as responsibility, of legacy not as inheritance but as living dialogue. He confirmed the existence of the Logan project without apology, framing it not as defiance but as necessity. The fashion world, he argued, had grown complacent, trapped by its own reverence for tradition. His work with Logan was not a rejection of Forrester Creations but a challenge to it. A demand that the institution prove its relevance rather than assume it. In doing so, he directly questioned Ridge's authority, not as a son challenging a father, but as a creator challenging stagnation. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Ridge's fury ignited in full view of the world, his sense of betrayal now sharpened by public humiliation. To him, Eric had not merely disagreed. He had undermined him before the very audience Ridge worked tirelessly to command. Brooke, caught between the two men she loved most, felt the ground give way beneath her. She saw Eric's actions as reckless, a gamble that risked destroying the family under the guise of artistic freedom. Yet even in her anger, she could not fully dismiss the conviction in his voice, the sense that he was speaking from a place of truth rather than spite. Katie, meanwhile, stood stunned by the magnitude of Eric's boldness. She had expected resistance, even backlash, but not this level of open defiance. Part of her recoiled at the chaos his announcement unleashed, fearful that her dream was becoming a catalyst for destruction. Another part, however, felt a surge of awe. Eric had not hidden behind her or used Logan as a shield. He had claimed the project as his own statement, absorbing the consequences without hesitation. In that moment, Katie understood that Logan was no longer merely a brand. It was a line drawn in the sand. Within the Forrester family, the fracture deepened into something unrecognizable. Loyalties hardened along ideological lines rather than bloodlines. Some saw Eric as a necessary disruptor, a reminder that even empires must evolve or collapse under their own weight. Others rallied behind Ridge, viewing his leadership as the last bulwark against chaos. The shared history that once bound them became a battlefield of interpretation, each side invoking the past to justify incompatible visions of the future. Conversations once marked by trust turned brittle, loaded with implication and accusation. The house that had built its legacy on unity now found itself divided by purpose. As the dust from the press conference settled, the fashion world braced for impact. What had once been an internal family dispute transformed into a full-scale industry confrontation. Forrester Creations and Logan now stood as opposing forces, each claiming to represent the future of design. The conflict was no longer theoretical, it was commercial, cultural, and deeply personal. Every collection, every campaign, every public statement became a strategic move in a war that promised no easy victor. The stakes extended beyond market share to the very meaning of legacy itself. In choosing to stand his ground, Eric had ignited a battle that would redefine not only the companies involved but the relationships that sustained them. Ridge, forced into open opposition with his father, faced the terrifying prospect that winning might still feel like losing. Katie, thrust into the center of the storm, had to reconcile her ambition with the human cost it exacted. Brooke, once the bridge between worlds, now struggled to see a path that did not end in devastation. And the family, fractured by competing truths, stood on the brink of a transformation that would leave no one unchanged. The fashion war had begun not with fabric or form, but with belief. Belief in what should endure and what must be challenged. As Forrester Creations and Logan prepared to collide, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about a single project or a single designer. It was about power, legacy, and the courage, or arrogance, to decide who gets to shape the future. And once that question had been asked aloud, there was no returning to silence. After the cameras were turned off and the microphones packed away, the silence that followed Eric's press conference felt heavier than any outcry. It settled over Forrester Creations like a thick fog, muting familiar sounds and distorting every interaction that followed. The building remained the same. Polished floors, curated light, the quiet hum of creative industry. But something essential had shifted beneath its surface. What had once been a shared space of ambition and legacy now felt fractured. Each corridor carrying the weight of unspoken allegiances and quiet judgment. The announcement had not merely exposed a conflict. It had altered the emotional architecture of the institution itself. Ridge experienced the aftermath as a sustained, internal combustion. The fury that had burned hot during the press conference did not dissipate. It condensed, sharpening into something colder and more dangerous. Publicly, he maintained composure, projecting authority and control, but privately he wrestled with a sense of displacement that unsettled him deeply. For the first time, his leadership was not being challenged by an external rival but by the man whose approval had once defined his sense of purpose. Eric's words echoed in his mind not as rhetoric but as accusation, suggesting that Ridge's stewardship of Forrester Creations had prioritized preservation over progress. The idea that his vision could be interpreted as stagnation gnawed at him, threatening to undermine the certainty he relied upon to lead. Within the company, reactions unfolded unevenly, revealing fractures that had long been concealed beneath professional decorum. Some designers and executives quietly expressed admiration for Eric's audacity, interpreting his stance as a necessary disruption in an industry increasingly resistant to change. Others recoiled, viewing his actions as a betrayal that jeopardized the stability they depended upon. Meetings became tense exercises in restraint, every proposal scrutinized for hidden loyalties, every creative suggestion weighed for political implication. The once unifying identity of Forrester Creations splintered into competing narratives about what the brand stood for and who had the right to define its future. Katie, watching these ripples spread outward, felt the weight of unintended consequence press heavily against her resolve. She had envisioned Logan as a space for reinvention and creative freedom, not a detonator for familial warfare. Yet as criticism mounted and scrutiny intensified, She recognized that retreat would not restore peace but validate accusations that her ambition was reckless. Eric's refusal to back down forced her to confront the magnitude of her own commitment. Logan was no longer a hypothetical venture, it was a declaration that demanded fortitude. Each article dissecting the project, each pundit framing it as a challenge to Forrester dominance, reinforced the reality that she was now a central figure in a battle she had not fully anticipated, but could no longer escape. Eric, for his part, remained resolute, though not untouched by the fallout. The clarity of his public stance did not shield him from private reckoning. He understood the pain his actions had inflicted, particularly on Ridge, yet he refused to interpret that pain as evidence of wrongdoing. To him, creation without risk had become an empty exercise, and silence in the face of complacency felt like complicity. In the solitude following the press conference, he reflected not on victory but on necessity, reaffirming his belief that the role of an artist was not to preserve comfort but to provoke evolution. That conviction sustained him even as it isolated him from those he loved most. Brooke found herself caught in a state of emotional suspension, torn between outrage and reluctant understanding. She could not condone the way Eric had blindsided the family, yet she recognized the stagnation he described with uncomfortable clarity. Years spent navigating the delicate balance between loyalty and independence had taught her that truth rarely announced itself gently. As the divide widened, Brooke felt the erosion of her role as mediator, the realization that this conflict transcended compromise. The fractures were ideological, rooted in incompatible visions of legacy, and no amount of emotional labor could seamlessly reconcile them. As the days passed, the fashion press intensified its scrutiny, transforming speculation into narrative. Analysts framed the conflict as a generational reckoning, casting Eric as the rebellious patriarch and Ridge as the embattled heir defending tradition. Logan, once discussed as a boutique revival, became emblematic of resistance against entrenched power. Forrester Creations, conversely, was portrayed as an empire forced to confront its own rigidity. Each headline sharpened the stakes, ensuring that any attempt at reconciliation would now unfold under the glare of public expectation. Behind the scenes, strategic maneuvers replaced overt confrontation. Ridge accelerated development timelines, determined to prove that Forrester Creations could innovate without abandoning its core identity. The pressure he placed on his teams intensified, driven by a need to demonstrate control and relevance simultaneously. Eric, meanwhile, embraced transparency, allowing glimpses of Logan's creative philosophy to emerge deliberately, countering narratives that framed the project as derivative or reactionary. The silence between father and son grew heavier with each calculated move. Communication replaced by parallel actions that spoke louder than words. The family gatherings that followed were marked by restraint bordering on hostility. Conversations skirted around the conflict without addressing it directly, every shared space imbued with the knowledge that neutrality was no longer sustainable. Members of the family began to understand that their silence constituted a choice. That abstaining from the conflict was itself a form of alignment. The sense of unity that had once defined them dissolved into a fragile coexistence, sustained only by habit and the hope that time might soften what pride had hardened. In this atmosphere, the idea of reconciliation receded, replaced by an acceptance that the confrontation had reached a point of no return. The battle between Forrester Creations and Logan was no longer about dominance but definition. Each entity stood as a manifestation of opposing philosophies, one rooted in legacy as continuity, the other in legacy as reinvention. The industry watched with fascination, aware that the outcome would ripple far beyond market share, influencing how power and creativity were negotiated in the years to come. As the war lines solidified, those at its center grappled with the personal costs of their convictions. Ridge faced the unsettling possibility that victory might demand sacrifices he was not prepared to make, that maintaining authority could estrange him irreparably from his father. Katie confronted the realization that ambition, once unleashed, required endurance as much as vision. Eric accepted the loneliness inherent in challenging institutions built in his own name. And Brooke, standing amid the wreckage of shared history, mourned the simplicity of a time when creativity united rather than divided them. The fashion war had evolved beyond spectacle into something raw and transformative. It was no longer a question of who would prevail, but of what would survive once the conflict had run its course. As Forrester Creations and Logan advanced toward their inevitable collision, one truth became undeniable: the struggle they were engaged in would reshape not only the industry, but the very relationships that had given it life. And in that reshaping lay both the promise of renewal and the certainty of loss.